The wind came down from the mountains, carrying the smell of early snow. Samuel Bridger stood at the edge of his property, watching the sun bleed into the western horizon, painting the prairie grass in shades of copper and rust. October in Wyoming territory meant short days and long thoughts, and Samuel had grown accustomed to both. He was 42 years old, though the mirror suggested older. The lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into distance, searching for threats that might never come, or storms that always did. His hands were scarred from 6 years of wrestling this land into something resembling civilization. A cabin, a corral, 40 acres of fenced pasture where cattle grazed with the same wary alertness their owner displayed. The war had taught him to notice things. Not the grand, obvious things, armies marching, cannons firing, but the small disruptions in pattern. A bird taking flight for no apparent reason. A sudden absence of sound. The way light fell differently when something blocked its path. That's what made him turn his head that evening. 50 yards from his northern fence line, a figure moved through the tall grass. Not walking. Dragging. One leg pulled behind like dead weight, body bent at an angle that spoke of pain so constant it had become posture. Samuel's hand went instinctively to the rifle he'd propped against the fence post, then stopped. The figure collapsed. Samuel waited. 5 minutes. 10. The grass moved only with wind. No ambush revealed itself. No war party appeared on the ridge. Just one man, fallen, and the prairie's indifference spreading in all directions. He should walk away. He knew this with the certainty of experience. In the 6 years since he'd buried his wife Elizabeth under a cottonwood tree that still hadn't forgiven him for bringing her here, Samuel had learned the mathematics of frontier survival. Every rancher between Fort Laramie and the Powder River could recite the equation. Kindness divided by caution equals death. But Elizabeth's voice still lived in his head, quieter each year but never quite silent. "We came here to build something better," she'd said during their first winter, when the cold had been so brutal they'd burned half their furniture just to survive. Not to become something worse. Samuel picked up his rifle and walked toward the fallen figure. Up close, the man was younger than Samuel expected, perhaps 25, perhaps ageless in the way people became when suffering stripped away the markers of time. Lakota, Samuel guessed, though he'd never learned to distinguish tribes the way the other ranchers claimed they could. The man's leg was a catastrophe of infection, the arrow shaft still embedded in the thigh, broken off a hand's width from the entry wound. The skin around it had gone purple-black, spreading like ink in water. The man's eyes opened. Dark and feverish, they fixed on Samuel's face with an expression that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite resignation. Something harder to name, something that made Samuel uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. "Water," Samuel said, then felt foolish. The man almost certainly didn't speak English. But thirst was a universal language, and when Samuel mimed drinking, those dark eyes blinked, understanding. The walk back to the cabin took 20 minutes. Samuel half carried, half dragged the wounded man, both of them breathing hard by the time they reached the barn. Not the house. Samuel drew that line without examining why. The barn, where he kept the horses and the milk cow and the ghosts of warmer seasons. He brought water in a tin cup. The man drank like he'd been wandering the desert, water spilling down his chin, his hands shaking so badly he needed help holding the cup steady. Samuel brought bread next, day-old but still good, and watched the man tear into it with desperate efficiency. They sat in silence as the last light died outside. Samuel lit a lantern and hung it from a beam, creating a small island of yellow light in the gathering dark. The man watched him constantly, those fever-bright eyes tracking every movement. Samuel felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. "You should have that leg looked at," Samuel said, knowing it was useless. The nearest doctor was 3 days' ride, and this man wouldn't last 3 hours on horseback. Even if Samuel wanted to help, and he was carefully not deciding if he did, there was nothing to be done except wait for infection to claim another victim of this endless, stupid conflict. The man spoke. A handful of words in a language that moved like water over stones, musical and incomprehensible. Then he pointed at Samuel's chest, at the space above his heart, and spoke again. The same words, insistent. Samuel shook his head. "I don't understand." The man tried once more, slower, pointing now at Samuel, then at himself, then at the bread. His hand moved in a gesture that might have meant offering, or might have meant debt, or might have meant something else entirely. Samuel nodded, not understanding, wanting only for this moment to end so he could return to his cabin and pretend it never happened. He left the man a blanket and another cup of water. "You can stay tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, you need to go." The man's eyes held his for a long moment. Then he nodded, a single sharp dip of his chin that might have meant gratitude, or acknowledgement, or farewell. Samuel walked back to his cabin through air that had turned knife cold. Inside, he bolted the door and loaded his rifle, then sat by the window watching the barn until exhaustion pulled him towards sleep. His last conscious thought was a memory. Elizabeth's hand in his during their wedding, her grip stronger than he'd expected, holding on like she already knew she'd have to let go too soon. When he woke at dawn, the man was gone. Only tracks in the frost showed he'd been real at all. Hoofprints, surprisingly, suggesting the man had found or stolen a horse somewhere. Samuel felt a complicated rush of relief. The decision was made for him. The stranger was someone else's problem now, or no one's problem, or dead in a ravine somewhere where the vultures would settle the matter with efficiency. Samuel made coffee and fried eggs and told himself he'd done the decent thing, the thing Elizabeth would have wanted, the thing that proved he was still capable of basic humanity despite everything this place had taken from him. He was carrying water to the horses when he saw them. At first, his mind refused to process what his eyes reported. It was too large, too impossible, too perfectly arranged to be real. But Samuel had learned in the war that impossible things happened with regularity, that the mind's job was to accept and adapt, not to waste time on disbelief. 200 warriors sat mounted in a perfect circle around his property. They'd positioned themselves overnight, in silence, in darkness, forming a living perimeter that extended from his northern fence line to the creek bed south of his barn. Every direction he could conceivably run, a wall of horses and men blocked his path. Lakota, he thought mostly, though he spotted the distinctive war paint of Cheyenne on some faces. An alliance, then. A statement. They weren't attacking. That was the first thing his mind fixed on, the detail that separated this moment from his imminent death. They sat their horses with supernatural stillness, faces painted, rifles resting across their thighs, lances planted in the earth like a fence of their own. Watching. Samuel's hands went numb. The bucket slipped from his grip, water splashing across his boots. He stood in his own yard, surrounded by every nightmare the frontier could conjure, and his body simply stopped responding to commands. Not fear, not yet. Something older than fear, something cellular, the recognition of being prey. Minutes passed, an hour. The sun climbed higher, burning off the frost, and still no one moved. The warriors sat their mounts with the patience of men who'd learned to wait for seasons to change, for herds to migrate, for enemies to reveal weakness. Samuel stood rooted like a fence post, waiting for the bullet or arrow that would end this paralysis. It didn't come. Finally, moving as if through deep water, Samuel retrieved his bucket and walked back to the cabin. Every step expected to be his last. Every breath felt stolen. When he reached his door and turned to look back, 200 pairs of eyes were still fixed on him, unblinking, inhuman in their collective intensity. Inside, he loaded every weapon he owned, the rifle, the pistol, the shotgun he kept for wolves. Then he sat by the window, and tried to think through the terror that made thought almost impossible. The man he'd helped was dead. That had to be it. The man had died, and they blamed Samuel. Or they thought he'd poisoned the water, poisoned the bread. This was an execution, delayed. A judgment rendered in silence before the sentence was carried out. But if they wanted him dead, why wait? 200 warriors could reduce his cabin to splinters in minutes. A single torch would do the job faster. Samuel had fought at Antietam, had seen what coordinated violence could accomplish, and this wasn't coordination for attack. This was something else. A test, perhaps, or a message, or, and this thought made his hands shake, something his exhausted, terrified mind couldn't begin to comprehend, because he lacked the cultural framework to interpret what he was seeing. The morning crawled into afternoon. Samuel didn't eat, couldn't. He sipped water from his canteen and watched the circle of warriors through gaps in his window shutters. They rotated positions occasionally, one man briefly dismounting while another took his place, but the circle never broke. They spoke rarely and quietly, voices carrying across the still air in fragments of language he couldn't pass. Around 2 o'clock, a rider appeared on the eastern ridge. Samuel recognized him, even at distance. Thomas Cartwright, who ran cattle on the adjacent property and who'd warned Samuel repeatedly about being soft on redskins. Cartwright reined up hard when he saw the assembled warriors, his horse dancing sideways in alarm. For a moment, Samuel thought Cartwright might charge forward anyway, guns blazing, forcing the confrontation into violence. But even Cartwright wasn't that stupid. He sat his horse for perhaps 5 minutes, taking in the scene, then wheeled around and disappeared back the way he'd come. Help, Samuel thought. Cartwright was riding for help, would return with every armed man he could gather. And this impossible standoff would transform into a massacre. The thought filled him with something beyond dread, a profound exhaustion, a sense of inevitability so complete it felt like gravity. This was how it ended then. Not with his death alone, but with the deaths of dozens, maybe hundreds, all because he'd given a stranger bread and water. All because he'd tried, for one evening, to be something other than complicit in the machinery of displacement and murder that had brought him to this contested land. The sun began its descent. Samuel's eyes burned from staring, his body ached from tension held too long, his mind spun in circles that led nowhere. He found himself thinking about Elizabeth, about the morning she died, how he'd held her hand and felt it go from warm to cool, life receding like tide from shore. She'd looked at him at the end, with something like disappointment, and he'd never been sure if she was disappointed in him for bringing her here, or disappointed to be leaving him alone. As darkness gathered, the warriors lit fires, small ones, carefully tended, creating a constellation of light around his property. The smoke rose straight up in the still air, carrying the smell of burning sage. Samuel watched the fires and felt something crack inside his chest, some last defense giving way under sustained pressure. He was going to die here. They all were. And there was a sick poetry to it, a kind of justice he couldn't deny, even as his body rebelled against accepting it. He'd come west to build a new life on top of an old life, on top of old lives, on top of graves that had no markers, and trails that had no names, and promises that had been broken before the ink dried. What had he expected? What had any of them expected? The night passed without sleep. Samuel sat at his window with his rifle across his knees and watched the fires burn down to embers, watched dark shapes move between them, watched the stars wheel overhead with their usual indifference. He thought about Elizabeth, about the war, about all the decisions that had led him to this particular moment of reckoning. He thought about the wounded man and wondered if his act of mercy had actually been an act of mercy or just another form of violence, unwittingly delivered. Dawn came cold and clear. The warriors were still there. On the third day, Samuel ran out of water. Thirst made decisions for you. Samuel understood this from the war, from watching men throw away every advantage for the promise of a creek they couldn't confirm existed. His water barrel sat in the barn, 40 feet of open ground that might as well have been 40 miles. He could try for the well, but the well was further, more exposed, and required bending down with his back to the circle of warriors, an invitation to arrow or bullet. The barn, it would have to be. He opened his cabin door at midday, when the sun was highest and shadows shortest, when exhaustion and heat might make the warriors fractionally less alert. He carried no weapon. This decision came without thought, without deliberation. Some instinct deeper than reason told him that crossing that space armed would guarantee his death, while crossing it helpless offered a chance, however slim, of something else. The 40 feet stretched into forever. Samuel walked slowly, hands visible and empty, eyes forward. He felt the weight of 200 gazes like physical pressure against his skull. His boots scraped against hard-packed earth. A crow called somewhere distant. The world had narrowed to these sounds, these steps, this moment that contained all possible endings. He reached the barn, pushed open the door. The sudden dimness inside made him stumble, his eyes struggling to adjust. He found the water barrel by memory, dipped his canteen, drank deeply with shaking hands. The water was warm and tasted of wood, and it was the most delicious thing he'd ever consumed. When he turned to leave, a man stood in the doorway. Not the wounded man Samuel had helped. This warrior was older, perhaps 50, with silver threading his braids, and a face carved by decades of weather and wisdom and witnessing. He wore a breastplate of bone, intricate and ancient-looking, and he held a rifle loosely in one hand, barrel pointed at the ground. His eyes held Samuel's with an intensity that made looking away impossible. They stood in silence. Samuel's heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst. The warrior took a single step forward. Samuel forced himself not to step back. Another step. They were close enough now that Samuel could see the individual scars on the man's face, could smell the sage smoke in his clothes, could read in his expression something more complex than simple hatred or rage. The warrior spoke. His voice was quiet, steady, carrying the weight of authority. He gestured toward the cabin, toward the barn, toward the land itself, his hands moving in ways that seemed to encompass everything and nothing. Then he stopped, waiting. "I don't understand," Samuel said. His voice came out hoarse from disuse and fear. "I don't know what you want." The warrior's eyes narrowed slightly, studying him. Then he reached into a pouch at his waist and withdrew something, holding it out. Samuel looked down at what rested in the warrior's palm, a piece of bread. The bread Samuel had given the wounded man, preserved somehow, or perhaps just a piece of bread that symbolized all bread, all offerings, all gestures that bridged the unbridgeable. The warrior spoke again, and this time Samuel caught a single word he recognized: brother. Comprehension arrived not as revelation, but as slow, terrible unfolding. The wounded man had been this warrior's brother. Samuel had fed him, sheltered him, and then, in the warrior's understanding, in the logic of reciprocity that governed his world, become bound by obligation. The bread had created debt. The water had established relationship. Samuel had done something irreversible without knowing it, had entered into a contract whose terms he couldn't read. But it was more complex than that. Samuel could see it in the warrior's eyes, in the careful way he held himself, in the gravity of his presence. This wasn't just about debt. This was about something harder to name. About possibility, perhaps, or the last fragile hope that two worlds might coexist without annihilation. This was a test, yes, but not of Samuel's willingness to die. A test of whether he understood, whether he could see beyond his own fear to recognize what was being offered. The warrior gestured toward the circle of mounted men, then back at Samuel. He drew a line in the dirt floor of the barn with his boot, a line that bisected the space between them. Then he looked at Samuel with an expression that asked a question Samuel could barely begin to understand. "I don't know," Samuel said, and his voice broke. "I don't know what you're asking me." The warrior studied him for a long moment. Then he did something Samuel would remember for the rest of his life. He smiled. Not a friendly smile, not warm, but something sadder and more honest. The smile of a man who'd hoped for one answer and received another. Who'd known disappointment was coming, but had asked anyway. He placed the bread on the ground between them. Then he turned and walked away, each footstep deliberate and final. And Samuel understood with absolute certainty that this was the last chance, that whatever was being offered would not be offered again. "Wait!" The warrior stopped but didn't turn. Samuel's mind raced. What could he offer? What gesture existed that could possibly answer this moment? He thought of Elizabeth, of her insistence on seeing people as people, of her refusal to reduce anyone to enemy or obstacle. He thought of the bread, of how such a simple thing could carry so much weight. He thought of the line drawn in the dirt, the question of boundaries, of where one world ended and another began. He walked past the warrior, out of the barn, into the glaring sunlight, where 200 warriors watched his next move with the intensity of men who'd staked everything on this moment's outcome. Samuel's legs shook, his vision tunneled, but he walked forward anyway, toward the center of the circle, toward the space where the fires had burned the night before. When he reached what felt like the middle, he stopped. He pulled off his hat, the one possession from his wedding day he'd kept, the one Elizabeth had given him with hands that trembled with nervousness and hope. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its history, everything it represented. Then he placed it on the ground. He had no words for what he meant by this gesture. He barely understood it himself. But it was something about laying down, about acknowledgement, about recognizing that this land had never been his to claim, that his presence here was theft, no matter how he justified it, that the only honest thing left was to admit it. The warrior emerged from the barn. He walked slowly to where Samuel stood, his expression unreadable. 200 warriors shifted on their mounts, tensions singing in the air like a bow drawn to breaking. The warrior looked at the hat, looked at Samuel. Then he reached down and picked it up, held it with unexpected gentleness, turned it in his hands, examining its construction, its meaning. He spoke again, those liquid words Samuel couldn't comprehend, but the tone had shifted. Less formal now, more personal. He asked a question. "My wife," Samuel said, pointing to his chest, to his heart. "She gave it to me." The warrior nodded slowly. He understood that, at least. The language of loss was universal. He held the hat a moment longer, then handed it back to Samuel. But in the exchange, his hand gripped Samuel's wrist, held it, and Samuel felt the calluses there, the scars, the evidence of a life spent in labor and warfare, in resistance and survival. The warrior released his grip. He drew something from around his neck, a small bundle wrapped in leather, decorated with quillwork and beads. He pressed it into Samuel's palm and closed Samuel's fingers around it. Then he stepped back. He spoke to the assembled warriors. His voice carried clearly in the still air, authoritative and final. The warriors began to disperse, not quickly but with deliberation, their horses turning away from the circle, the formation breaking like ice in spring. Within minutes, they were moving away in all directions, disappearing into the landscape that had birthed them, leaving only churned earth and the ghosts of fires to mark their presence. The older warrior was the last to leave. He looked at Samuel one final time, and in his eyes, Samuel saw something that might have been respect, or might have been pity, or might have been the recognition that both of them had been trying to do something impossible and had, in their own limited ways, succeeded and failed in equal measure. Then he, too, was gone. Samuel stood alone in his yard, holding the leather bundle, wearing his wedding hat, surrounded by the trampled evidence of a siege that had never quite been a siege. The sun beat down, the wind picked up, carrying dust and the smell of sage. His legs finally gave out, and he sank to the ground, still gripping the bundle, his body shaking with relief or terror or grief. He couldn't tell which, and maybe it didn't matter. Thomas Cartwright arrived 3 days later with 17 armed men, ready for war. They found Samuel sitting on his porch, hollow-eyed and changed in ways that couldn't be measured. He told them the warriors had left. He didn't try to explain why. The words didn't exist, or if they did, he no longer had access to them. The men searched the property, found the tracks, the fire pits, the evidence of an armed force that could have massacred everyone for 50 miles. They looked at Samuel with confusion and suspicion, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they understood about how these things worked. "You're lucky," Cartwright said finally, the words sharp with something that wasn't quite accusation. "Lucky they didn't kill you." Samuel didn't argue. He was lucky, though not in the way Cartwright meant. He'd been given something that felt more like curse than blessing, the knowledge that mercy was possible, but insufficient, that understanding could be reached, but not sustained, that the violence was inevitable, and all their small gestures of humanity did was make the violence more tragic when it came. The bundle the warrior had given him contained a single eagle feather and a small stone, polished smooth by water or hands or time. Samuel kept them in a box Elizabeth had brought from Ohio, the box where she'd stored her most precious letters, the ones from her mother and sister that he still couldn't bring himself to read. He never showed the items to anyone. They were his to carry, his to remember, his burden and his gift. The winter came hard that year. Samuel kept his ranch, though several neighbors suggested he sell and move east where things made sense. He didn't sell. Something had rooted him to this place that went deeper than ownership, deeper than documents or fences or the arithmetic of survival. He'd become part of something here, something he didn't fully understand but couldn't walk away from. He never saw the older warrior again. The wounded man's fate remained unknown. But sometimes, standing at his fence line at dusk, Samuel would see riders on distant ridges, silhouettes against the sky that appeared and vanished like memories. He never knew if they were real or imagined, present or past. He never raised his hand in greeting or reached for his gun. He simply watched, bearing witness, holding the weight of what he'd learned, that there are gestures that change everything and explain nothing, that mercy is a currency whose exchange rate can never be calculated, that the bread you offer in the evening can summon judgment by morning, and judgment can arrive wearing faces more complex than simple vengeance. Years later, when the frontier had closed and the wars had ended, and the land had been divided and fenced and renamed by people who'd never asked its original name, Samuel would tell the story to his children. Children who came later, from a second marriage to a woman who understood silence and loss. He told them about the bread and the water, about 200 warriors and a leather bundle, and the moment when all possible futures balanced on a gesture neither side fully understood. His children asked what it meant. They wanted the story to have a moral, a lesson, a clear point that explained what had happened and why. Samuel never gave them one. Some stories, he learned, weren't meant to teach lessons. They were meant to be carried, one generation to the next, reminders that the world is more complicated than our stories about it, that kindness can be dangerous and danger can be kind, and that we are all, always, only a single gesture away from changing everything or understanding nothing. The eagle feather and the stone remained in Elizabeth's box, artifacts of a moment that refused to be reduced to meaning. On winter nights, Samuel would sometimes take them out and hold them, feeling their weight, remembering the weight of 200 gazes and one warrior's hand on his wrist, and the line drawn in the dirt that had asked a question he still couldn't answer. He kept the bread box, too, the one where he'd kept the loaf he'd shared that October evening. He never put bread in it again. It sat empty on his shelf, a wooden vessel holding only air and memory, a testament to the moment when he'd learned that sometimes the simplest human gesture can become the most complicated human truth. And he kept living on that land, working it, watching it change, becoming part of its history whether he deserved to be or not. He was, he understood finally, neither hero nor villain in this story. He was simply a man who'd offered bread and received something he couldn't name in return. Something that felt like forgiveness and accusation, wound so tightly together, became indistinguishable. Something that would shape the rest of his days without ever fully revealing its shape. The prairie grass still grew the same. The wind still carried the same ancient messages. The mountains still stood their eternal watch. And somewhere in the complexity of all that had happened and all that couldn't happen, Samuel Bridger found a way to live with what he'd learned. That we are all strangers on this earth, all limping through our own territories of pain and hope, and the bread we share might save us or doom us, and there's no way to know which until long after the sharing is done.